Up next on Booked on Rock, how enduring icons like Springsteen, the Beatles, the Stones, Pink Floyd stay on top in an ever-changing music game. Why rock stars never retire? Find out next. Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Eric Senich. David Hepworth is on the podcast. He's the author of the book, Hope I Get Old Before I Die, Why Rock Stars Never Retire. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thanks for having me.
To understand where we are today with these rockers that are still rocking into their 70s and 80s for some, we have to go back to Saturday, July 13th, 1985, Live Aid, right? Why is that date so important?
Well, you got to start a story somewhere, and you got to finish it somewhere. I always think the best definition of a story is it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You decide what the beginning, the middle, and the end is. I feel very close to Live Aid because obviously that's coming up for its 40th anniversary very soon. And I was one of the BBC presenters, one of the presenters of the BBC's coverage of Live Aid. So I was there, kind of thing, which is always interesting to look back on. But I suppose as I looked back on the years since, I realized that on that date in 1985, when Paul McCartney got up to close the London end of the show by singing Let It Be, we all looked at him and thought, well, there he is, the venerable old figure. There he is. He's come down from Mount Rushmore to give it one more go round, you know. And then he'll presumably retire. And of course, what I realized looking back was he wasn't old at all. He was 43.
Yeah.
You know, and nowadays, 43, people are barely starting at the age of 43 nowadays. Right. And that certainly applied to him. You know, so for people like Paul McCartney, the kind of second half of their career, if you like, was kind of just starting there, and it's still going on to this day, which is something that nobody envisaged. And so, I wanted to write a book. You know, loads of people have written books about how people become rock stars. You know, there's lots of variations on that kind of creation myth. You know, the early years and the achieving hits and fame and so forth. I just thought it'd be interesting to write about their middle years and their older years and how they adapted, you know, to the passage of time, and what it says about them and also what it says about us, which is often the thing that interests me most about musicians and kind of rock fame, if you like. It's as much the creation of us, the fans, as it is a creation of them. You know, they've simply responded to continuing public demand and continue to do it, you know. So I was just intrigued at how these figures who they're your fantasy friends that you acquire at the age of about 14, and they look down on you from their posters on your bedroom walls. And then, you know, 60 years later, they're still there. They're still part of your life in a way that nothing else is. You know, everything else is gone and changed. You know, you're kind of, you don't retain your same relationship with a sporting team or anything like that. You don't retain the same relationship with movie stars, but you do with rock stars. And that really interests me.
Yeah, it's a psychological thing. Makes you feel young, or brings you back to those years where you remember what it felt like to be young and carefree and have little to no worries.
I suppose so. You know, I think it's Bono that said that, you know, that when bands get together to tour, you know, and bands have been together for a long time, and the show starts, the audience get 50% of their value just from seeing you there. You know, just from seeing, there they are, those old pals of mine, still, and oh look, they're still friends, and we feel that. I think obviously this applies particularly with bands, because bands are kind of, they're not just musical aggregations, they're kind of gangs. They're you know, they're schoolboy associations continued into adult life, and so it warms our heart to see them together. You know, when people see Mick and Keith still together after all this time, huge amount of the appeal is just sentimental. It's
Very much, very much. As a huge Van Halen fan, when Dave and Eddie got together again in '07, it was that to
yeah.
see them hugging at the press conference, and whether it was genuine or not, we felt it was. So there was that emotional moment. I actually last night I was just watching YouTube, just searching around, and it's suggesting things, and all of a sudden, sure enough, there's an AC/DC clip from 2024, and most of the comments were, in fact, I remember one of them was, "It's bringing a tear to my eye to see Brian Johnson back, and so happy."
Yeah.
And with Angus.
It's so strange that, I suppose the association with this music has always been sentimental, but it's clear that it's sentimental when you get into the 60s and 70s and 80s,
Yep. But you talked about how Live Aid being televised was a huge thing, too, because that exposed it to an audience that was maybe an audience that would never even pay much attention, but it was there in front of them. And I remember I was 12, 13 years old. It was everywhere. I mean, ABC, MTV, all the news outlets were covering it. As you say, you were there, so you know. So how did people see these artists before Live Aid, and how did it change?
Well,
after?
I think I always think prior to Live Aid that the people who went to big shows, were a very particular group of people. They were kind of long-haired guys in greatcoats who queued up all night outside venues to get tickets or sent off checks, postal orders, and so forth. And then post Live Aid, what seemed to me to happen was that, and a huge part of it in the UK was the fact that the sun shone, which is not something you take for granted in London. And consequently, the images from Wembley were very appealing. And also, everybody was doing 3 songs or 4 songs. They weren't doing their new album. They were doing the greatest hits. And so there were millions of casual TV viewers that day who came in from, mowing the lawn or going to shopping or picking up the kids and looked at Queen doing, We Are the Champions or The Who or whatever, and thought, I fancy that. I quite fancy that kind of experience. It looks really nice. It looked really appealing. And so it can't be a coincidence that, in 1985 was, I think it was the year that Bruce Springsteen did his first outdoor show. And it was very much kind of nervous toe in the water. He did it in Ireland. He did it as far away from the United States as possible, as these things are always done. He played at Slane Castle in 1905 in Ireland. And he talks about it in his autobiography, and that he'd been kind of pretty much railroaded into doing it because he'd never wanted to play outdoor. And he came off half time in the interval and said to John Landau, his manager, and he said, I can't do this. I can't do it. This is terrible. And John Landau pretty much said, well, you're going to have to get used to it. And so he did. And so the whole scaling up of live entertainment, I think, dates back to Live Aid. That's the point at which it became no longer arenas. It became stadiums. It became no longer 10,000 people. It became 80,000 people and big screens. And I think that's the beginning of what I regard as the era we're still in now, which is the age of spectacle, which is, I think, when people go to big outdoor shows, you can see Taylor Swift nowadays or whoever, I don't think they're encountering it as a musical thing particularly. I think it's a spectacle thing. I think it's a social thing. You have to be there. You have to be part of the large demonstration here. I don't think anybody comes away from these kind of shows going, I really like the middle 8 on the third number. And,
Right.
They just don't interact that way. What they do is they say, I love the bit where they flew up in the air or the whiz bangs went off, And those shows have it increasingly over a long period of time.
I think of Beatles at Shea, kind of that was, but there were no cameras to film the whole show.
When nobody could hear it.
Yeah, and nobody could hear it, and it was like a spectacle.
But yeah, and you couldn't see much. Whereas what they've done now is they adapted completely to to the scale of the thing. And I think Live Aid was kind of beginning of that. And Queen were the most successful act of the day in the UK, certainly. And that was because they kind of used the audience as part of the spectacle. You will sway back and forth, you will clap your hands in this fashion, because you'll like the idea of doing that, and it'll look good on the television. So I think that's the beginning of the age of spectacle, is Live Aid in 1985, and of course it continues to this day. I had thought it would have been all over with COVID. I thought we're going to see no more large gatherings of huge numbers of people, not for a while. Shows how wrong I was.
Yeah. You may have answered my question then, because you said Freddie Mercury. There couldn't have been a better person to usher in the new age at Live Aid better than Freddie. And there were some great performances, obviously, Bowie and U2, but Freddie was the guy.
I think they were one of the few groups who had really understood what an opportunity it was. Because when Bob Geldof started doing it, he wanted what he regarded as the older acts: Queen, Elton John, David Bowie, The Who, Paul McCartney, because only if he got those would American TV want them, because they wouldn't want, I don't know, Spandau Ballet or Sade or whatever. And I think they came with varying degrees of preparation, but I think Queen had really prepared. They'd gone away, for a couple of days. They'd taken a rehearsal hall. They'd worked out a set, which is a pared down version of their greatest hits. And so what they presented was effectively a live commercial for Queen. This is you may have forgotten about this lot. Here are all the hits. Here's one. Here's another one, and so forth. And they came out at the right time of the day, when the audience were primed but not tired, which is an important thing. And also the audience, don't forget, a very different audience, a unique audience, in that they were not dominated by fans of one particular act, which normally is the case. They were people who come along because they were quite happy to see Nick Kershaw, Led Zeppelin, whatever, and everything in between. So they were a very forgiving audience, and they're very much on the performer's side. They wanted it to work. And so you mentioned U2. U2 assumed, when they left the stage that day, they assumed their career was over. They thought they'd just done the worst possible thing, that Bono had wandered off the stage down into the crowd with no very clear idea what he was supposed to be doing.
Because they cut a song from the set because of it.
They couldn't see him. The band could not see him.
Right.
I mean, imagine what that's like. What are we still playing?
Right. How do you follow his cue? What are we doing next?
Yeah, absolutely. And they kind of reassembled in the dressing room, and they barely spoke to each other, And then, but of course, thanks to television, it kind of came over as something sort of heroic, oddly enough. I don't know why that should be, but it just does. And that worked for them in a huge way. So they were one of the acts who really gained out of the day, definitely.
I became a Springsteen fan, going back to Bruce again. I became a fan when I heard the box set, Live 75 to 85. I told the story before. I borrowed it from my brother-in-law. My sister's husband had it. I borrowed it for about, 4 years, 5 years. And finally said, do you still have that? I think I do. I listen to it once a week. I do. But anyway, that's how I became such a hardcore fan of Bruce. And you do bring this box set up in the book. It's this particular box set that plays a big role in transforming artists like Bruce into what we now call heritage acts. So talk about why that box set is so important.
Well, it's interesting that you should borrow it from your brother-in-law, who I'm assuming was older than you.
Yes.
And probably better paid than you at the time.
Very much so, yeah.
So consequently, he could afford to go and buy a box set. The New York Times, on the day it came out, it was a huge deal. Tower Records on Broadway opened early at 8:00 or whatever. And all these trucks arrived, piled it high, and all the people in the queue, they're all people in their 30s and 40s. They're not teenagers, because they can afford to do it, And there was it's quite interesting. New York Times has interviews people about why they're buying it. And what they talk about is they all felt some kind of duty to buy it. This is a kind of important thing. I felt I ought to do this. I've always been a fan or whatever. And it was duty rather than enthusiasm. And I was very interested in this because I think this is the point at which people start thinking that these performers are artists of substance, and substance becomes a hugely important part of the way that they're sold. And it's an interesting thing because the box set particularly, it sold like crazy for like a week and then fell off a cliff really fast, as the old record business adage has it shipped gold and returned platinum, but it achieved that objective of fixing Bruce Springsteen as this kind of great American artist, this great American icon, which is a position he still manages to occupy to this day. Yeah. Although, interestingly enough, how many hits has he had since those days? I don't know. It's probably not that many. I don't know. Philadelphia may have come after.
Right. That was mid-90s.
So Bruce Springsteen goes on stage today, anywhere in the world. What people want to hear largely are the songs from the earlier part of his career. It doesn't matter how long the career is, 40, 50 years. Most of what we want to hear tends to come from the early bit of it.
Right. Up through Born in the USA.
Yeah, that probably is it. There's cover versions and all that kind of thing. People like that. And listen, I'm not knocking Bruce Springsteen because Bruce Springsteen has managed to sustain people's interest in him. And I think this is because it's all about the band in an odd way. I came to a conclusion. This may be controversial. I came to a conclusion a few years ago, and I've interviewed Bruce Springsteen loads of times and seen him loads of times. What makes Bruce Springsteen interesting is Bruce Springsteen within the context of that band. He's the guy who, when he was unknown, so go back 71, 72, he says, it's going to be Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. Now, imagine how much ego it took to do that when nobody had heard of you. You know what I mean? I'm going to pretend it's James Brown of the Famous Flames. Even though nobody's heard of me, doesn't matter. I will grow into that part. And so when people go and see him nowadays, what they're seeing is him with the old gang. There's the gang. And so many of his songs and his kind of reference points are about the story of him and the band. When Clarence dies, he's replaced with somebody who kind of is a younger version of Clarence.
Sure, his nephew, yeah.
It's just the way it works. I've seen him on his own, and I think, well, that's fine, but it's just not as exciting. It's him with his old pals. That's the story. And so what Bruce Springsteen does on stage is he enacts his own autobiography musically. He does it brilliantly well. He's a genius at that kind of thing because he understands far better than anybody else in rock and roll the importance of having a show that tells a story. He's always understood that. Nobody, I'm staggered at how his competitors don't seem to have noticed that this is what he does. Because I don't think anybody else even tries to do it. You know what I mean? Well, he did it when he was unknown. And how much more powerful is it now when he's had, 50 years of being fantastically well known, So it's the great narrative arc in his shows. And so when people go nowadays, they're thinking, well, are we coming to the close of the show? I don't want to miss the close of the show. It's a show that's been going on all those years, all our lives. It's a very powerful thing. Very, very powerful.
His set lists are very much, I think, like the Grateful Dead, where he mixes it up. Let's move on to Grateful Dead, because this is an interesting chapter in the book about, here's a band who you would never have thought would have an ice cream, name after them. And it become, that logo is just is so recognizable. Talk about the ice cream, the Cherry Garcia ice cream, and the importance of that, and just how it exposed them to a bigger audience.
Well, it just appealed to me, the idea that, I'm kind of old enough to remember the Grateful Dead as kind of when they were great outsiders,
right?
It's like when Frank Zappa said about the mothers of invention. We look like the kind of band that if we moved next door to you, your lawn would die. Well, the Grateful Dead were kind of a bit like that,
right?
When they first appeared in Britain, it was like, what are these guys on about, and Dark Star and their strangeness. But something happened to them, in the late 80s and 90s. They became kind of cuddly. They became warm and embraceable to a wide variety of people. And that had many different manifestations. And the adoption of Ben and Jerry decided to launch the Cherry Garcia flavor of ice cream. Just seemed like the perfect totem of this. And they did this as a result of some deadhead writing to them and saying, have you thought about doing a flavor called Cherry Garcia? Because everything in the Grateful Dead put the name on sells. And that's really interesting because the great heroes of the counterculture, and I'm an admirer of the Grateful Dead, great heroes of the counterculture also became the kind of leading lights of kind of merchandise culture, of internet fan lists, of contacting your people, having your community, monetizing your fame as much as you possibly can, keeping the money to yourself and not sharing it with Warner Brothers or whoever. All those things that we've come to recognize as things kind of bands have to do to stay together nowadays. They were sort of the first people to do this, which I think is very, very interesting. But in the process, they became warm and cuddly, didn't they? So were they, I think they were honored at the Kennedy Center, weren't they, a few years ago?
I think so.
If you'd asked somebody, in 1973, do you think there will ever be a time when, the members of the Grateful Dead will be honored by a president or whatever, or will be at the Kennedy Center? They say, get out of here, don't be stupid. You know what I mean? And because the world kind of came round to that point of view, and a lot of what the Grateful Dead's appeal is, they just kind of keep doing it, don't they? And I think I was reading the other day that Bob Weir there's talk of Bob Weir and, well, the two drummers are still alive, aren't they?
Oh yeah, Bill Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart.
Mickey Hart. And I think there's talk of them, and a lot of that is just keep doing it. And if you keep doing it, eventually, well, this happened to the Grateful Dead years ago, but eventually it happens to all musical acts. If you keep going long enough, you're a legend. You wake up one morning and you're a legend. And you're a legend in the eyes of a bunch of people who don't remember you the first time. Because that's the thing that happens. It gets transferred from generation to generation. And so, I know, my kids, anybody who they don't remember appearing, but was just there, they think legend. Willie Nelson, legend. Tom Jones, legend.
Sure.
And that's, and there used to be the case that people liked the hot new thing and didn't like the old thing. Well, actually, if anything, that's completely turned on its head. They like the old thing because they feel better about the old thing, because there's a perception that anything old is somehow more authentic than whatever's been invented last week. And there are loads of examples of this, Bob Dylan, I've been looking at Bob Dylan since, 1963. And I look at him now and I think, I know no more now than I knew back then, because your mystique is just endless, Now, is it possible for artists who come along in the age of social media, in the contemporary panopticon, where you know everything, Is it possible for anybody to have mystique
Oh,
like that?
that was a question I was going to ask in the internet era and the social media era that we're in.
I don't know. It'll be, only time will tell, and I won't be there. But I can't help thinking that when I look at Bob Dylan, he seems like the best possible example of the power of following the old advice: never apologize, never explain. and I think one of the most dismaying things about contemporary music stars is their tendency to apologize for absolutely everything. So whatever is the latest scandal, and there will always be, when there is not a week goes by when there isn't, fans have taken to the internet to express how cross they are about this, that, and the other. And it's all just nonsense. But the musicians will tend to apologize. We've reached the stage, of course, where the Rolling Stones no longer perform Brown Sugar. I think I'm right in saying. I think on the last tour they didn't do it because.
Oh yes, you're right. I remember this. Okay.
I think Mick had said no, we can't do it anymore.
Right.
And Keith made some reference to it about the sisters or something, I don't know. But I sort of think, when I look at the Rolling Stones, if the Rolling Stones are not in some level offending somebody, what's the point of the Rolling Stones, for God's sake?
Yeah. What was the Guns N' Roses? Was it Greatest Hits or Box Set or something? But they removed "I Used to Love Her," the song "I Used to Love Her," but I had to kill her.
Oh,
I think that was the one. But point being, they're in a sense apologizing, saying, "Sorry, we wrote that. We won't. We're going to pretend like it."
Well, it's very,
But if it's art, it's like watching an old movie where somebody's in blackface. I mean, we get that that's not right, but that's what represented the culture that we were at the time from an artistic standpoint.
Well, also it always interests me that if you go back into blues and jazz, the amount of violence in those songs, that
Right.
people don't say anything about because that's kind of quaint and old.
The Steel Wheels tour is what you bring up in the book, though. How big that was. That
was the first new age tour, really.
Right.
That was the first tour to be where the promoter was Michael Cole, Canadian, who kind of revolutionized the scaling of tours, and he basically said to them, "Well, look, however much money you've been getting out of tours in the past, I can pretty much double it, And how are you going to do that? Well, we're going to charge more for tickets because people will pay more for tickets. And we're going to sell a lot of merchandise, and we're going to bring in corporate sponsors in a way that you've never done it before. And we're going to run it more like, Major League Sports." And this they did very successfully because the first thing they did was build an enormous set, with kind of walkways and ladders, because you have to do something. As you increase the scale of the thing, you have to increase the scale of what people are getting, what people are seeing. You have to give them something to look at. So it's a little bit like the old theatrical joke about, I came out whistling the sets. That's what happened with that tour. So every tour that's taken place since has pretty much been in the footsteps of Steel Wheels.
Right.
And it's still going on to this day. How much can we charge? Slightly more than we charged last time. How much is everybody else charging? Okay, we'll peg it round about that level. And of course, the profile of the people going has changed so much. I think I talk about this in the book. The first time I saw Bruce Springsteen was in 1980 at Madison Square Garden, Thanksgiving. And he would have been 30. My memory, I often try and think about this. In my memory, looking around Madison Square Garden, I don't think there would have been anybody there that night who was over the age of 40. And they would have been very much at the older end. Whereas nowadays, you can do anything. The starting age is 8, and the older age is 80 and more, And the tickets for these shows, you used to obtain them by going and queuing up outside the box office, all night or sending off your check or your cash or whatever. Well, nowadays it's an internet. It's all about speedy internet connections and credit cards, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's bound to be the profile of going and people going is bound to be different. So if teenagers go nowadays, they very often go with their parents. And that really changes the nature. I never did that. It wasn't, the idea of anybody's parents going with them to a pop music show in the 60s would have been utterly inconceivable. And also you've got these interesting dynamics that it becomes a competitive thing between parents. So-and-so's parents, she's got tickets for Taylor Swift. Can't you get tickets for Taylor Swift? It's a challenge to every red-blooded father. My credit card's as good as anybody else's.
Yeah.
There's a competitive element to this, no doubt about it.
This was last year. I was going to see a Red Sox game with my nephew. He's 20. And all he wanted to listen to on the way there was rap. Kanye and Kendrick Lamar, And I said, do you or any of your friends listen to rock? The only name he brought up, he goes, yeah, I have one friend who listens to Pink Floyd. I said, okay, I'll take that. What is it about Pink Floyd? Like, at what point did they become...
Wow.
As you point out in the book, more famous than the members of the band themselves.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're a wonderful example of the great truth, which is that the most valuable thing any band has is not the song catalog or the lineup. It's the name. In the end, it's the name. And there's a classic case of this with Pink Floyd, which is that Roger Waters, pretty much left the group expecting them to pretty much stop. That I'm the main singer, I'm the main songwriter, and this is all over if I'm going over here. And of course, he found that the other members of the group were not going to stop at all; they were going to keep going. And so he assumed that fans would still flock to see him, and they didn't really. Very hardcore fans did. But he still has to kind of, I don't know what he done on his last tour, but it wasn't that long ago that he was billing himself as the genius behind Pink Floyd on the posters, which is a pretty sad state of affairs if you have to do that, really. And also the beautiful thing about Pink Floyd, I always thought, was that they were kind of anonymous. When people think of Pink Floyd, they don't have a very strong visual image. If you have a visual image of Pink Floyd, it tends to be either the covers of Dark Side of the Moon or whatever, or it's some light show in the distance, some kind of psychedelic colored amoeba pulsing, with these 4 or 5 figures in shadows at the front. And those 4 or 5 figures could be anybody, really. It's not like you have a visual image of the Rolling Stones, and it's Mick and Keith. You have a visual image of Pink Floyd, it was never Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters. It just wasn't that at all. Therefore, people would be quite happy to go along and see a lineup of the Pink Floyd that didn't necessarily, contain all their favorites, as long as it delivered the kind of Pink Floyd experience, And, they were definitely a beneficiary of that, and they were always internationally successful, kind of before a lot of British groups were. It always used to strike me that they were more popular in France or South America or whatever than they were in the UK. But they are also an extraordinary example of the fact that, bands who are formed amongst a bunch of teenagers, and they rehearse in scout huts and they play the church hall and whatever, and they spend life in the back of a van for a while. Even in their 60s and 70s, they very often bear grudges still to this day that don't go away, And the kind of feuding between Roger Waters and Dave Gilmour is an absolute classic case of that. Still goes on, They had some exchanges over social media a few years ago that I and many other people just naturally assumed would end up in a court of law, but never did, because they obviously think, Oh, that's just the way we carry on. That's the way we carried on since we were 18, you know.
Right.
And it always fascinates me. You've got teenage relationships carried on into the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, how they got together for Live 8 still is pretty amazing. That was in 04, I think, right? Was that 04?
Yeah, something like that.
But then you find out later, like Gilmore said, and Richard Wright and Nick Mason were like, yeah, it wasn't really the greatest experience having to be up there with Roger and deal with him again. And you think, man, couldn't you at least just kind of hug it out and say, oh, look what we did together? But
no,
it's not going to happen.
No, you know, somewhere at the back of their mind is the memory of what somebody said after a gig in Seattle in 1982 that you don't know about and you never will know about. You know what I mean? There's a really good book came out a few years ago written by Dan Zanes about Tom Petty. I don't know if you ever read it. And Dan Zanes was a member of, what's the group called? Delfuegos, something like that.
Oh, yes, I've had him on.
Okay, yes.
Warren Zanes, I think. Are you?
I may have that wrong.
Yep,
anyway,
that's all right.
There's a book about Tom Petty.
Yeah.
And he clearly spends a lot of time with them, with the Tom Petty and the band. And so he reports all the things said after gigs. And there's one particular occasion when they're on the bus and there's some bust up. And I think it's Stan Lynch and Mike Campbell or whatever. And somebody says, and I never liked your wife. And you thought, there's no coming back from that. Now listen, in every band, there has been an incident like that. It's never been recorded, but there has been. It's bound to have been. You think about it. They're living in each other's pockets under massive pressure. Bad times, good times.
Egos.
Egos, sensitivities, public attention, money, all that. Of course that's bound to happen.
Why is he on the cover of Rolling Stone and we're not?
Oh, God. Yeah, absolutely.
We did take a picture for Rolling Stone, but for some reason we're not on it.
They didn't use it. They cropped us out of it.
Right.
They never liked us.
I love the one with Steven Tyler and Joe Perry literally over spilled milk where one of the wives or girlfriends dropped milk and Joe Perry or Steven Tyler or whatever said, pick that up. And the other guy said, don't talk to my wife that way.
Quite. Fair enough. You know what I mean? But, it's the kind of...
And Nancy Wilson over... was one of their boyfriends didn't like the other's children, the way they're acting. Don't talk to my kids that way.
Yeah, you're bound to. That's bound to. Listen, it happens in every, it happens to everybody.
Sure.
We're not in bands, but they've got they are locked together through eternity, which is, it's a difficult thing, most of us never have to deal with it. They do. I got Bill Wyman. Bill Wyman told me that after the Steel Wheels tour, I think, they had been a long time deciding about whether to go on tour because Mick and Keith had been doing solo records and falling out, whatever. And so Bill Wyman said at the end of the tour, he said, that's my last tour because I can't deal with this uncertainty. And so 2 years later, he gets a phone call. We started rehearsing, in a few weeks' time. Are you ready? He says, no, I told you I was leaving. And Mick Jagger said, I thought you were joking.
Wow.
And I thought this was a fantastic story because the Rolling Stones, you can't resign from the Rolling Stones. There's no HR department that you can go and see, is there? You can't go and say, when did you first decide? Where would you like to be in the next 2 years? It doesn't exist. You're signed up. It's like being a member of the royal family. You're born into it, kind of, and it's assumed you will be there forevermore. And so he said, no, I told you, I've had enough. And they just didn't believe him. And that's partly because there is no way of sending in your notice in the Rolling Stones. There's no way of having an accounting and saying, well, thank you very much for your service.
Right.
It always interests me about bands. In my experience, they never talk about the important things, ever. They keep off the subject. They talk about tonight's gig the record they're making, whatever, and everything else we can deal with that at some point. They kick it down the road, which is maybe why they're still going.
Yeah, the story of him and Charlie Watts. You called him the drummer.
Well,
Charlie knocked him out.
My drummer.
My drummer. That's right.
My drummer. But you see, I got a lot of sympathy. I'm sure that's an exaggerated story, but I have a lot of sympathy with drummers because I think the drummer is the most important member of the group. I think the drummer is the person you can't replace. Ringo, John Bonham, Charlie Watts, Levon Helm. Can't be done. You might get a, inverted commas, better drummer. It's not the point. Not the point at all. It's the drummer for that band.
Right. So true. I actually was listening to Lonely at the Top from Mick, his solo song. It's a great song, but boy, what if Charlie was on this? What if he saved that for the Stones? You can't help but think that.
It's the fingerprint of the group, old-fashioned groups, was the drummer. Because the drummer played in a certain way, because the drummer was built in a certain way. They could no more change the way they played than change the way they walk. And so the sound of the group coalesced around the drummer. I think there are loads of examples of this.
Let's talk about MTV's Unplugged, because that's important too, because I still look back in that and I think, boy, MTV catered towards the teen 20-something audience, but it worked, and you got these artists like Eric Clapton in his 40s really just bringing in huge numbers as far as who watched and then who would buy the album.
It was weird, really, because it's a television construct, isn't it? The idea is you're gonna all sit on stools and you're gonna play acoustic guitars, and the cameras are going to be very near to you, and you're going to tell your old songs, but because you're going to do them acoustically, they're going to have less kind of visceral attack to them, and they'll all end up sounding vaguely poignant, which will suit the vibe of the show, And loads of people tried to change the format. Bruce Springsteen didn't do it unplugged, did he? He did it with a band because he wanted to do it with his new band, not very successfully. But Eric Clapton's the kind of classic case, that version of Layla, which he didn't want it on the album. He didn't think it worked. And I can kind of understand why. But that became the biggest hit of his entire career, because it came along at a time of CD sales and a massively expanded market. And then, of course, it had the terrible, tragic incident of Eric Clapton's son dying in that appalling accident in New York. And then, the song Tears in Heaven, which was actually lyrics written, but not by Eric Clapton, but by Will Jennings, and that became an important part of it. And so there was a sense that as people get older, they've got to be careful how I say this. I don't want anybody to take this the wrong way, but people the fans warm to the sense that people have gone through tragedy, losses, illnesses, divorces, and so forth. It binds them with the fans. Once they get beyond 40s and 50s, everybody's paint is scratched a bit, People like that. And this is why I talk about this whole thing about everybody comes back as a legend, And the Glastonbury Festival in Somerset in the UK, which is, Europe's biggest festival, and is televised and so forth. They have a Sunday afternoon slot, which they now call the legend slot, where they get the most unlikely people come along, and a younger audience completely embraces them because they're a kind of grizzled old trooper who's, got a few miles on the clock. People like that idea. Well, one of the people, it seems to me, whether he intended to or not, who had such a successful late career as a legend was Johnny Cash, which I always date to the first of those deaf American or American recordings albums that made with Rick Rubin. that came out. The cover picture was taken by a guy I know, an English photographer, Andy Earle. And I don't even recall that picture where it's taken on a railway line in Australia. And he's wearing some kind of, I don't know what you call it, a duster coat or whatever.
Yeah.
Flares out behind him like Robert Mitchum in whatever that film was, The Vengeful Priest, whatever.
Right.
And I always think Johnny Cash, after that, made about another 6 albums, I think. And they were all trying to be albums that lived up to that photograph, and they did. Everything he did later on struck everybody as kind of gothic and profound. You can't do that when you're in your 20s. You can do it when you're in your 60s and 70s. People really warm to that idea,
Another one we're going to get to, we haven't yet, is the Beatles. And like you say, who's bigger than the Beatles? The Beatles. At least at one point that became, just like you say with Johnny Cash, at some point, it seemed like in the mid-90s, once we got that anthology series, suddenly the Beatles become bigger than the Beatles. Like a lot of these Beatles experts that I have on the show will say, the Beatles weren't always this larger than life thing. There was a point there where there was interest that was lost in them, and at some point they became this huge draw. How and when did that happen? Do you think it was mid-90s with the anthology?
I think there's many stages to it, actually, and I've written about this in more than one book. John Lennon dies in 1980, and that brings about a whole resurgence of, people's feeling about John Lennon and about the Beatles. And it's only in the early 80s, this is a good indication of this, that some bright spark at EMI recording studios in Abbey Road says, why don't we call the studios Abbey Road? Prior to that, nobody thought of it. We used to drive past that all the time in the 70s and never thought about it at all. Nowadays, you can't get down Abbey Road for young people having the pictures taken on the zebra crossing. So, the 80s was one thing, but then in the 90s, you had the coincidence of the anthology series of reissues. And in Britain, that coincided with Britpop, with Oasis and Blur and Pulp and many others. And the interesting thing about all these bands was that they were all huge fans of the Beatles, and they were fans of the Kinks and the Who and the Rolling Stones. They were fans of an earlier form of British pop music, which they promised to kind of continue the work of. So that was one thing. And the other thing was anthology. And I think it's remarkable because George Martin, I think 2 years before then, had been interviewed in the Times. And one of the questions they put to him was, is there anything left in the vaults by the Beatles? And he said, no, I've been through all the vaults and there's nothing. There's nothing at all. 2 years later, there were 3 double CDs because the difference was some bright spark realized post Bob Dylan's Biograph and the bootleg series and all those things that you could sell people fragments. You could sell stuff as archaeology rather than polished, finished stuff. There was a different audience for polished, finished stuff. There was a new audience who wanted the archaeology, wanted to hear the fragments, wanted to hear the bits of studio chats, wanted to feel they were there in some way because they were responding to it as history, with all the excitement of history. It'll never be like that for me because it was my teenage years. I remember these things as live things happening when I was 14, 15, 16. So you got that kind of interest. And CD was the technology that enabled that to be kind of monetized, as they say. And then subsequently, that kind of ran into the 21st century where, you got, desktop recording machinery and endless access to kind of outtakes, bits of video. The Beatles became a thing you could play with forevermore, really. They'll just continue to give you the bits and you can assemble the Beatles in a way that appeals most to you. And I think also as that era has receded from direct memory, it increasingly seems the fact that they did what they did seems increasingly miraculous, just absolutely extraordinary in a way that it didn't at the time. It just, one of the things, one of my hobby horses is, people talk about pop music nowadays moving really quickly. No, it doesn't. It moves really slowly nowadays. It moved really quickly in the 60s. Boy, that's how come the Beatles went from Love Me Do to Strawberry Fields Forever in 4 years?
Amazing. Yeah.
Well, it would have been quicker than that, probably. You can't imagine the velocity of change in the 1960s. Unimaginable. Whereas nowadays, and here's the thing that people often say to me, is that if you listen to a band from now and you listen to a band from 10 years ago, there's no difference.
Right. Yeah, the creative ambition with the Beatles, what they did such...
I think it's a technology as well.
Yeah.
It's a combination of... Genius is not a thing you are. It's a thing that happens. And it happens under certain circumstances. When those 4 personalities get together with George Martin in Abbey Road at that time, when tape has just kind of come along, and then, 4-track, 8-track, whatever. And if you want an orchestra, I can get you one. And the daftest idea you possibly have, we'll entertain it. Nobody's going to say to you, no, you can't do that. Not at all. Because you're the Beatles and you're writing your own check at the time, So we'll never see that again. Also, the business is innately conservative now. It doesn't want to move too far ahead of the public. Nobody thought about that in 1966, 67. Because whatever you heard, if you take the classic years, I don't know, 1965, it all say is the great year of the single, Satisfaction, Get Off My Cloud, Knock on Wood, Help, Like a Rolling Stone, whatever Beach Boys record came out that year. You were hearing something every week that was completely unlike anything you'd ever heard before. Every week. Every single week. When the Kinks came along and did See My Friends, you thought, my God, what's that? That's made a record like that before. When Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Loving Feeling, there hadn't been a record like that before. Hadn't been a record remotely like that before. And that was the 60s, the speed of change. And even in the 70s, there was considerable speed of change. But then it slowed down. And it's still slow to this day. So it still feels to me as if, pop music is moving forward with the handbrake fully on, because it doesn't suit the business for it to move too fast.
We talked about the internet earlier, Universe Zero effect. What is that? And how does it argue for the internet's benefit to older artists?
Well, it's classic case of this. Only last week, I pulled out a record that I'd had since 1980 and had never played. And this is a record on Brian Eno's, ambient series by a guy called Laraji, who's an American, a record called Day of Radiance. And I just happened to play it. And I thought, God, this is fantastic. It's a really good instrumental record. I thought, I wonder what happened to him. And of course, nowadays I can, go straight onto the internet, find, he's still with us. He's 82. And then I can look at all the records. And then I can go on Spotify and I can see I could listen to 25 of his records. And this is something completely unknown. 25 of his records are still there to this day. That didn't happen in the world before the internet. Let me tell you, if you had a record coming out, it came out, it was there for 6 months, then it disappeared. Totally disappeared. I would be completely forgotten. Nowadays, and you can't argue about whether it's a blessing or a curse, nothing is forgotten. Nothing at all. It's all there forevermore. So people are constantly discovering elements of the past. My children, grandchildren, whatever, they have access to a far wider range of music than I've ever had access to. What they do not have is any sense of the chronology of that music. No sense at all. They wouldn't know whether Elvis Presley came before Radiohead. They just wouldn't know. It's just all there all the time. And so it turned out to be, I think, a huge benefit. Acts complain about getting paid. David Crosby David Crosby no longer with us, but David Crosby in his later years used to rant on about how bitter he was about the fact that he couldn't make any money out of records. And I used to think, well, all right, David, I kind of understand that, but you're still famous, David. Nobody's forgotten you. You know what I mean? That didn't apply to early generations of musicians, I go and see Ben Sidran not long ago. Ben Sidran used to be a member of Steve Miller's band, a keyboard player, who I always used to quite like, and, got some of his early albums. I went to see him at Ronnie Scott's in London last year, I think it was. And then afterwards, I looked on Spotify. I think he's got 45 albums. They're all still there. And I'm sorry, if you're an 80-year-old musician, isn't that a good thing?
Sure.
You can turn around and go, that's my life's work. There it all is. It hasn't disappeared. You don't have to go and find it, And so I think
more people are going to want to see you live because of it.
And you're charging more money for it, as everybody is. And, don't blame them for that, And here's the other big change that was applied in the years covered by the book. It used to be that to buy an album was more expensive than to buy a ticket to go and see somebody. Well, that hasn't been the case since 1980, probably, And now you can have the music for free, but it's $500 to go and see something, It's a different thing. But the internet has made everybody's musical career longer, and will continue to do so, because you can be the most obscure group in the world. Your fans can find you nowadays. They didn't used to be able to. It was utterly impossible. You didn't know whether people were dead or alive. When Jim Morrison died in Paris in 1971, do you know how long it took the news to get to London? 2 weeks.
Oh my God. Yeah, that is crazy. That is crazy.
Because it had to be, because it took a while to reach California. Yeah. And then somebody in London, they'd heard a rumor that he died. The Melody Maker printed, we've heard a rumor that he died, but we can't confirm it. And then a week later, we confirmed it via California. Now, when Amy Winehouse died, I knew long before the announcement on social media. Now I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that's the world you live in, So musical careers are way longer because of the internet.
You mentioned Steve Miller. I'm going to be interviewing an author who wrote a fantastic book on Boz Scaggs.
Oh, right. Oh, really? I'm a big fan of Boz Scaggs. Right?
Yes. Jude Warren is a very good book. But he was a guy who disappeared in the 80s and came back, which leads to my question, because Joe Elliott of Def Leppard was asked once, did you ever think about intentionally breaking the band up, going away for a while, and then coming back for dramatic purposes, to draw more attention? He says, no, we're never going to go away. We're going to keep going until we stop, until we're all gone. There are artists who do go away and come back, and like the Guns N' Roses, it's a big deal. So I don't know. Is that something?
Well, I do think the thing about the Rolling Stones is they kept going.
They kept going. They never went away and came back.
They nearly went away, and they would have gone away if any of them if Mick had a solo success.
Of course, yeah. That's what he wanted in the mid '80s. There, yeah.
Well, so any of them would.
Keith was pissed off. He was keeping songs for his solo album. He's like, "Why aren't you using this for ours?"
And that's the great thing about bands, is that they eventually realize that they're worth far more together than they will ever be worth separately. Even in the cases like Phil Collins, who had a lot of success on his own. Probably not more than Genesis, really, And so there is a lot to be said for plugging away, because reunion albums, it's very difficult to live up to people's expectations, I think, really. And there are cases of bands I write about in the book, bands who never brought it off, really. It's like the Byrds broke up and then reformed about 2 years later in a very underwhelming fashion. Whereas if the Byrds had just kept going, what I mean, they could have done. They could have had members leaving, joining, whatever. It wouldn't have mattered. I think continuity is a good thing. I think it's a powerful thing for bands. I'd speak to quite, as you probably do, I speak to quite a few musicians in their 70s, and these might be people that you talk to in their 40s. And their attitude now is so different. Their attitude is grateful in the 70s. I'm deeply grateful anybody cares, that I can fill a room and people come along, And there might have been a time when I was dissatisfied with that, but it's not now, not at all. So
they get to do what they love and make a living still. They didn't have to go get some job, painting houses or whatever they got to do to scrap together enough money to survive.
Well, I remember asking Ron Wood about this years ago, that he'd gone to art college, and when he told his mother he was leaving to join whatever band he was joining at the time, she said, "Oh, why don't you stay at college and get a qualification and all that?" And he was talking to me in his 50s, I suppose, about the people he knew who'd left school and got the qualifications. I said, "What are they doing now?" He said, "They all got early retirement."
Right.
They all got made redundant or whatever. Well, you get made redundant from the Rolling Stones, as Bill Wyman discovered.
Yeah. Well, and the key is publishing. Get a good publishing deal, and you'll be okay.
Well, yeah. Don't give it away.
Author Robin Platts, I had on to talk about a book on the Zombies, and they signed this deal when they first started. It was so rare that they were leasing their music to the record company.
Oh, really? So they've still got it. They've still got those rights.
Yeah. That was so rare, because usually they take advantage of these guys when they're
I'm sure
16, 17 years old.
Well, I was talking only the other day, and I never talked to him before, Justin Hayward.
Woody Blues, yeah.
So Justin Hayward used to sing with Marty Wilde. He used to play with Marty Wilde in the UK, and he was like 16, 17. And he was playing down the bill somewhere on the east coast of Britain. I can't remember where. And top of the bill was Lonnie Donegan. Lonnie Donegan was a big name in skiffle in the UK.
Oh, the Beatles.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
Loads of people talk about Lonnie
Beatles
Donegan.
loved him.
And Justin Hayward was introduced to Lonnie Donegan by Marty Wilde, who said to him, "This lad's really talented and he can write songs." And so Lonnie Donegan said, "Why don't you sign to my publishing company?" And he said to Marty Wilde, "Should I do this?" Marty Wilde said, "No, don't do it." But he did. So consequently, Nights in White Satin and all those things still owned by Lonnie Donegan's publishing.
Yes. Oh, man.
It's just, oh, my God.
Who was it the Animals, too? What was that? There was one where they just threw the names on there because they ran out of room.
Well, the
they
Animals
left the guy out, or
the Animals. I think the classic story about the Animals is "House of the Rising Sun" is obviously a traditional song, but it was traditional arranged Alan Price, who was the keyboard player.
Yes.
So consequently, whatever revenue came from that, which must be a lot over a long period of time, all went to one member.
Yes, that's the story.
Because he arranged the fantastic keyboard solo in the middle of it, So, but bands nowadays, you hope, are wiser, and there certainly seems to be cases, Radiohead and U2, and not that they're spring chickens, REM, all these bands who shared their publishing, they appear to have avoided falling out with each other as a consequence.
Sure, yeah. Billy Squire's the famous story. He's got all his publishing, so why doesn't Billy Squier tour? He doesn't need to.
No.
If he wants to, he could.
Yeah.
But he's okay. We're winding down. Just a few more questions. Actually, it's really a combination question here, because I'm wondering where you think we'll go now, 10, 20, 30 years from now, when these artists are gone. How can these legacy artists sustain? And I combine that with this idea that Kiss has for an Avatar show. So, what are bands going to do you got these, like as you say, you got these companies that specialize in managing the affairs of these late acts. Where are we going from here?
Well, I think it's very difficult to predict because, people say, oh, the Beatles and, Motown and Bob Dylan and whatever, they'll always be played. They'll always be popular. They might be. They might be. But I recently read a fantastic 2-part biography by a guy called Gary Giddings, an American writer, which I heartily recommend. You deal with music books on your podcast. This is a brilliant music book, 2-part music book about somebody, not rock and roll at all, but somebody who was, for most of the 20th century, America's biggest musical sensation and is now largely forgotten, Bing Crosby. No, who talks about Bing Crosby nowadays? Who plays Bing Crosby records?
Unless it's Christmas.
Unless it's Christmas, one record. Louis Armstrong. Who talks about Louis Armstrong? So you've no guarantee, that these things will continue. They may do, they may not. They may be forgotten for 20 years and then come back. I think it's interesting that things like, the Bob Dylan film, Timothy Chalamet, and the Elton John film, and there's a Springsteen film, isn't there, being made, and they're going to make 4 separate films about the Beatles. And so all these artists are being prepared for a future entertaining people who don't know who they are. So they're going to be recreated for those people. And that's just the way it's going to be. As far as the kind of Kiss type of kind of spooky, high-tech Disneyland reinvention, there's a very successful case of this in London, has been for the last few years, which is the ABBA show, Voyage.
I've heard a lot about that.
Which is enormously popular. And I think maybe just about to go into profit because it costs so much money to develop it. And I often sit there and try to think of another act that you could do that treatment with. And I've failed to come up with one. Yes, there's something about ABBA. It's 4 people, it's 2 girls, 2 blokes. Also they're still alive. There's something about the character of the music. Maybe Kiss might work because they're cartoons, in the first place.
Yeah, we're not going to see a Bob Dylan Avatar. I don't think.
No, but also
I don't think that's coming.
Another point with Kiss is, do they have the same residual affection that ABBA have? I'm not sure they do. You know what I mean? Everybody knows what ABBA sound like. Everybody likes ABBA on some level. Not the same thing with Kiss. Not the same thing at all. So I think there's going to be there'll be a lot of money spent in trying to prove this either right or wrong.
Right.
And a lot of money may be wasted.
Well, so it really depends on the artist, and it's going to be up to some creative people to see how they can present, because we know the music itself, if you can get it to people in future generations, a lot of them they're going to love it. The question is, how are you going to get it to them? Like, how are you going to present it to them? What kind of package is it going to arrive in?
I think it's also certain kinds of music. If we get towards the end, I'll leave you this final point. All pop music ends up sounding poignant. Pop music plus time sounds poignant. ABBA, no better case of this than ABBA. All ABBA songs now, 50 years later, sound vaguely sad and wistful. And that's what we like about them. And I think the same thing would apply to, I don't know, ELO, similar music. People feel the same way about that kind of music. Pet Shop Boys, the Oddest Things, the Bee Gees, that kind of works. I'm not sure about rock bands myself, actually, but I may be proved wrong.
It's up in the air. Yeah, we'll see. It'll be interesting within the next 10, 20 years. We'll see. Hope I get old before I die. Why Rock Stars Never Retire. It is out now, and you can find it wherever books are sold. Look for it in your nearest bookstore as well, and you can always find your nearest bookstore at bookedonrock.com. And David, actually last night you may have noticed I friended you, signed up for you on Instagram, Facebook, and X. So people can find you at all 3, right?
All right. Yes.
Do you have a website? Any?
Yeah, just davidhepworth.com. Yeah,
Okay.
they find me there. Yeah.
So I'll put the links up on the show notes. People can reach out to you.
Okay, then.
David, thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. And let's see what happens in the year 20. We'll have you come back 2035, 2040. We'll see where we're at.
I may be a bit slower then.
We'll have your avatar on if we need to. Thanks, David.
All right. Nice to talk to you. Cheers.